There was a moment in the 1970s when a child could vanish from their front yard, and America didn't even have a system to find them. No Amber Alert, no missing child hotline, no faces on milk cartons yet, just silence. And a poster stapled to a telephone pole. Cast your mind back to a decade where the most ordinary parts of childhood were quietly, invisibly dangerous. Where the things that should have kept you safe sometimes made things worse. Where every parent smiled on the outside and quietly worried themselves to death on the inside. The 1970s were golden for a lot of reasons. But beneath that golden surface was something darker. Something every American kid felt in their bones even if they couldn't name it. Welcome back to American Retold.
The channel where we sit down together and remember what America was really like before everything changed. I'm so glad you're here today, because this one is personal. This video is about the fears that shaped an entire generation of American children. The nightmares they carried, the things that made them run inside when the streetlights came on.
The headlines that their parents tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. We're going to walk through the streets of 1970s America together. We're going to visit the playgrounds and the TV sets, and the emergency rooms and the headlines. And by the end of this video, I think you'll understand why so many people who grew up in that decade turned out the way they did. Some of what you're about to hear is funny in that painful, cringe-inducing way only nostalgia can be. Some of it is genuinely shocking. And some of it will make you look back and wonder how on earth any of you made it through. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Hit that subscribe button because we do this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back. The 1970s in America were a decade of beautiful contradictions. On one hand, you had bell-bottoms and mood rings and the Jackson 5 playing on the radio. On the other hand, you had Watergate, Vietnam, stagflation, and gasoline lines stretching 3 blocks long. Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in August 1974, and children watched their parents sit in stunned silence in front of the television. Gerald Ford took over and famously declared that our long national nightmare was over. But for millions of ordinary American families, the nightmare had barely begun. Inflation was ravaging household budgets throughout the decade. In 1970, the average American family earned around $9,870 a year. By 1979, that figure had risen on paper. But a loaf of bread that cost 25 cents in 1970 cost 53 cents by the end of the decade. A gallon of gas went from 36 cents to over $1. Families felt it in every grocery trip, every tank of fuel, every pair of kids' shoes. Jimmy Carter took office in 1977 and spoke honestly about a national malaise, a crisis of confidence that had settled over the country like a fog. And yet somehow, despite all of this, life went on. Kids still got up in the morning and rode their bikes to school. Moms still packed lunches in brown paper bags. Dads still came home from work and sat down in front of the 6 o'clock news. Saturday morning still meant cartoons in your pajamas with a bowl of sugary cereal. Cap'n Crunch was 89 cents a box, and that was a luxury. The culture was electric. Disco was born. Star Wars exploded into theaters in 1977 and changed cinema forever. The Evel Knievel craze had every boy in America jumping his bicycle over increasingly dangerous obstacles. CB radios were the social media of their day. Happy Days was on TV, showing a sanitized version of the 1950s that felt like comfort food to a country that desperately needed it. But underneath all of that warmth and color and pop culture energy, underneath the mood rings and the fondue sets and the shag carpeting, there was real fear growing in the hearts of American children. And a lot of it came from places nobody expected. The playgrounds that were quietly trying to kill you if you grew up in the 1970s. Your playground was basically a medieval torture device with a slide. Cast your mind back to those magnificent, terrifying structures. Metal jungle gyms that sat on concrete. Not rubberized safety surfaces. Not wood chips. Concrete. If you fell off the monkey bars, and you would fall off the monkey bars, you met the ground at full speed with nothing to slow you down. The merry-go-round was the most dangerous piece of equipment ever invented for children. You grabbed the bar, ran as fast as your legs would carry you, leapt on, and immediately understood what centrifugal force meant. Kids flew off those things on a weekly basis, and nobody really stopped them because it was considered character building. The metal slides in summer got so hot in the sun that they would genuinely burn the backs of your legs through your shorts. You know exactly what I mean. That specific hiss you made when the metal hit your skin. Then there were the seesaws with no cushioning whatsoever, designed specifically so that the kid on the other end could jump off and send you crashing into the earth. The Consumer Product Safety Commission estimated that in the early 1970s, approximately 200,000 children per year were treated in emergency rooms for playground injuries. And the solution from most school districts and parents? You'll be fine, go back out and play. There was no such thing as a liability lawsuit in the minds of ordinary families back then. You just hoped for the best. Those playgrounds shaped a generation of kids who had absolutely no concept of self-preservation. And somehow, you loved every terrifying second of it. The stranger danger era begins the 1970s, were the decade when America's relationship with childhood innocence cracked right down the middle. The disappearance of children became a national conversation in a way it had never been before. In 1973, a little boy named Eitan Patz from New York City would eventually become one of the most famous missing children in American history.
Though his disappearance in 1979 marked the true turning point, but throughout the decade, a quiet, creeping awareness had already begun. Parents who had grown up in the 1950s letting their kids roam freely were starting to feel something was wrong. There was a shift in the air. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children didn't exist yet.
There were no standardized procedures for police departments when a child went missing. In many jurisdictions, officers would wait 24 to 48 hours before taking a report seriously. So what did parents do? They started talking to their children in hushed, serious tones at the kitchen table. Don't talk to strangers. Don't get in anyone's car. If someone offers you candy, you run. These conversations terrified children in ways their parents didn't fully realize. Because when you're 7 years old and a grown-up sits you down and tells you the world is dangerous, you believe them completely. The fear didn't come with instructions, it just settled into the bones of an entire generation of American kids and lived there. Those were the days when childhood got a little bit smaller. The television that brought the dark world into the living room before the 1970s. The evening news was something adults watched while children played in the other room. But by the mid-70s, the television had become the centerpiece of American home life. And it was not always showing pleasant things. The news coverage of Vietnam was still raw, still ongoing at the start of the decade. Images of war that would have been unimaginable on American screens 15 years earlier were now playing between advertisements for Tang and Tide detergent. Then came Watergate. The Senate Watergate hearings in 1973 preempted children's programming for weeks. Kids came home from school expecting Gilligan's Island and found politicians in suits talking about things they didn't understand but somehow sensed were very bad. And the local news had discovered that fear sold. If it bleeds, it leads became the operating philosophy of local television stations across the country. Crime stories, house fires, car accidents, all delivered in grave tones right before the family sat down to dinner. Children absorbed all of it. Studies from the era showed that children who watched more television reported higher levels of anxiety and fear about the outside world. But nobody turned the television off. It was the era of Mary Tyler Moore and All in the Family and MASH, and the news came with the package. The television didn't just entertain American kids in the 1970s. It quietly, persistently, and effectively frightened them. Toys that would make today's safety inspectors faint. Here is where things get genuinely extraordinary. The toy industry in the 1970s operated under a philosophy that can best be summarized as good luck. Lawn darts, also known as jarts, were sold in family toy stores across America. They were essentially weighted metal spikes designed to be thrown through the air by children. You don't need me to finish that sentence. Between 1970 and 1988, lawn darts were responsible for thousands of injuries and at least 3 confirmed deaths, including the death of a 7-year-old girl in 1987 that finally led to their ban. But in the 1970s, they were sitting on shelves at Kmart, right next to the hula hoops. Then there was the Creepy Crawlers Thingmaker, an oven toy that operated at temperatures that could cause serious burns. The Easy Bake Oven, beloved by millions, also ran hot enough to leave marks. Slime toys were made with chemicals that caused skin irritation. Lead paint was still turning up in toy manufacturing well into the decade. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab, which actually contains small amounts of radioactive material, had been sold in the 1950s, and its legacy hung over the era as a reminder of just how creatively dangerous the toy industry could be. The Consumer Product Safety Commission was only established in 1972, and it took years to build the teeth to actually do something. In the meantime, American children played with their potentially lethal Christmas presents and called it a good Saturday. Those toys were ridiculous. Those toys were wonderful. And they will never ever be allowed again. The chemicals in your everyday life. This one is the section that makes 1970s adults feel genuinely betrayed when they learn about it. Because the things that were supposed to be normal, safe, domestic, weren't. Lead was everywhere in 1970s America. Lead paint in homes built before 1978. Lead in gasoline, meaning that every car that drove past your house was venting lead particles into the air. Children playing near busy roads were breathing in lead emissions every single day. Research published decades later suggested that elevated childhood lead exposure across the 1970s contributed to measurably lower IQ scores on a population-wide level. The EPA only began phasing out leaded gasoline in 1973, and it took until 1996 to complete the ban. Then there was asbestos. Asbestos insulation was in schools, in homes, in ceiling tiles that children sat under for 6 hours a day. Pesticides like DIT had been banned in 1972 following Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. But other agricultural chemicals were still used liberally. Children in farm communities played in fields that had been recently sprayed. Nobody handed out information pamphlets. Nobody explained the risk. You just lived your life surrounded by things that were slowly doing damage nobody had connected to a cause yet. And the extraordinary thing is this, the parents weren't negligent. They genuinely didn't know. The information hadn't reached them yet. They were doing their absolute best with what they had, and that somehow makes it even harder to think about. The medical world that was still catching up. Healthcare in 1970s America was available, yes, but it was also deeply imperfect in ways that directly affected children. Vaccines existed for polio and smallpox, but the MMR vaccine for measles, mumps and rubella was only introduced in 1971. Before that, measles outbreaks moved through schools like wildfire. A child with a high fever and a rash was a common sight. The chickenpox vaccine didn't exist until 1995. So every single child in the 1970s went through chickenpox. Every single one. You sat in your bedroom covered in calamine lotion trying not to scratch, while your mother told you stories and brought you ginger ale and soup. Dental care for children was a different story altogether. Fluoride wasn't in all public water supplies yet. Dental drills were slower and louder and more terrifying. The dentist chair was the stuff of genuine childhood nightmares. Mental health was almost entirely unaddressed in children. If a child was anxious or fearful, or showing signs of depression, the most common response was they'll grow out of it. Learning disabilities like dyslexia were not widely understood. Children who struggled in school were often labeled slow rather than differently wired. The medical system was doing what it could, but for American children in the 1970s, the gaps were wide. And the fall was real. The world outside the front door, perhaps nothing captured the terror of American childhood in the 1970s, quite like what was happening in the cities. Urban crime reached historic levels across the decade. New York City recorded 1,680 murders in 1971. Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles were not far behind. The crack epidemic hadn't arrived yet. But heroin was devastating urban communities in ways that left visible marks. Children walking to school in city neighborhoods passed things they were too young to understand. Abandoned buildings. Burned out cars. Evidence of a world that the adults around them were clearly struggling to manage. The South Bronx in New York City became a national symbol of urban decay after the fires of the mid to late 1970s. Jimmy Carter visited in 1977 and stood in the wreckage like a man surveying a war zone. Because in many ways it was. White flight had hollowed out tax bases in dozens of American cities. Schools lost funding. Police departments were understaffed. Parks went unmaintained. And through all of this, children went to school, came home, did their homework, and tried to make sense of a world that the grown-ups seemed to have temporarily lost control of. The extraordinary thing about American kids in the 1970s is not what frightened them. It is that they found joy anyway, that they laughed anyway, that they rode their bikes and played their games and fell asleep dreaming of Saturday morning cartoons, in spite of everything the decade threw at them. That is the real story of American childhood in the 1970s. And if you were there, you will never forget it. Here are 3 things about 1970s American childhood that will genuinely surprise you. Did you know that the first mandatory seatbelt law for children in the United States wasn't passed until Tennessee did it in 1978? Before that, car travel with children was creative. Kids rode in the back window, they stood up in the front seat. One hand on the dashboard, one hand on adventure. Did you know that the Stranger Danger campaign as a formal public awareness program wasn't launched nationally until the early 1980s? Throughout most of the 1970s, there was no unified message. Parents were winging it with individual conversations at kitchen tables across America. And did you know that toy safety recalls in the 1970s were almost entirely voluntary? Manufacturers didn't have to comply. Some did. Some looked at the problem, shrugged, and kept shipping. The Consumer Product Safety Commission had authority but very limited enforcement power in its early years. It wasn't until a series of high-profile injuries and deaths built enough political pressure that real mandatory recall powers were strengthened. You genuinely could not make this stuff up. In the 1970s, a child could leave the house in the morning and not return until the streetlights came on. No cell phone, no GPS, no way for parents to reach them. Just the understanding that they would be home by dark. Today, most parents in America track their children's phones in real time. School pickup lines stretch around the block because walking to school has become something that requires safety committees to approve. In the 1970s, children drank from garden hoses, ate dirt occasionally, and survived on Wonder Bread sandwiches made with hands that weren't always freshly washed. Today, the hand sanitizer dispenser is the first thing you see walking into an elementary school. In the 1970s, a scrape was cleaned with hydrogen peroxide, which stung like the surface of the sun, while someone told you to stop crying. Today, there are pediatric wound care specialists. Neither approach is entirely right. Neither approach is entirely wrong. What is true is that children in the 1970s developed a certain resilience, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the world around them demanded it. They fell down and got back up. They got scared and kept going. They lived in a world that was imperfect and sometimes dangerous and genuinely uncertain, and they built something real from it. The children of the 1970s became the parents and grandparents of today. And somewhere in the back of their minds,
they still know how it felt to ride a bike with no helmet down a hill in the summer sun. Hold on to that. It matters more than you might think. Now I want to hear from you, because the stories that come through the comments on this channel are honestly some of the best things I read all week. We have been talking about fear today, but we have also been talking about survival.
About the way an entire generation of American kids took all of that uncertainty and somehow turned it into a life. I want you to tell me in the comments below, what specific thing from your 1970s childhood frightened you the most? Was it the news, the playground, a specific toy that, in hindsight, absolutely should never have been sold? Or was it something quieter?
something nobody else seemed to notice but you? Drop it in the comments. Let's build something real together down there. Because that is what this channel is about. Real memories. Real voices. Real America. We started today with a child vanishing from a front yard in a country that had no system to find them. And we end here, with the understanding that fear and childhood have always existed side by side in America. In every decade. In every neighborhood. In every family sitting around a dinner table trying their best. The 1970s were not the safest time to be an American child. But they were, in many ways, one of the most formative. The kids who grew up in that decade learned something that is very hard to teach. They learned that the world is not entirely safe. They learned that danger is real. And they learned by doing it every single day that you can walk out into that world anyway. That you can be afraid and brave at the same time, that the streetlights coming on doesn't have to mean the end of anything. It can just mean it's time to come home. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this video moved you, or surprised you, or made you pick up the phone and call someone who remembers these days alongside you, please hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds and it means the world to this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. Because next week we are going somewhere equally vivid, equally surprising, and equally real. We are going to be talking about a chapter of American history that most people remember with a smile, until they start remembering it properly. You are not going to want to miss it. Until then, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember, America has always been a story worth telling.